By the time the interview ended, Ben Shapiro would do something he had never done in 17 years of broadcasting. He would stand up mid-conversation, rip off his microphone, and walk out of his own studio while the cameras were still rolling. One phrase would haunt him for weeks afterward, replayed across every platform, dissected in every comment section, turned into the kind of viral moment that defines careers and destroys reputations. The phrase was simple, just 11 words long, but it would prove unanswerable. What made him say it? What made a man who built his entire brand on never backing down from a debate abandon his own show with 23 minutes still remaining in the scheduled hour? You're going to want to hear this. The interview had been announced 6 days earlier with the kind of promotional fanfare Shapiro's team usually reserved for major political figures or celebrity controversies. The thumbnail showed Shapiro in his signature pose, leaning slightly forward, one eyebrow raised in that expression of perpetual skepticism that his audience had come to expect. The text overlay promised fireworks. Representative Jasmine Crockett had agreed to appear on the Ben Shapiro Show for a full hour of what the promotional materials called an unfiltered conversation about race, policy, and the future of progressive politics in America. Shapiro's announcement video had been characteristically confident. He told his 14 million subscribers that he looked forward to a substantive policy discussion with someone he described as representing the new face of the Democratic Party, though he made sure to note with that particular inflection he used when he wanted his audience to understand what he really meant that she had been in Congress for less than 2 years and came from what he called a safely Democratic district where anyone with the right letter next to their name could win. The interview began exactly as Shapiro's interviews always began. He welcomed Crockett to the show with practiced courtesy, thanked her for making time in what he assumed must be a very busy schedule, and then immediately pivoted to what he clearly considered his opening advantage. He noted for the audience that Representative Crockett had a background in civil rights law, which he said was admirable, but that her legislative record consisted primarily of what he characterized as symbolic gestures rather than substantive policy achievements. He rattled off a prepared list. She had co-sponsored bills on police accountability that went nowhere. She had made speeches on the House floor that generated social media attention but changed no votes. She had, in his assessment, mastered the art of progressive performance without demonstrating any meaningful understanding of how policy actually worked in the real world. Shapiro leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his chest, wearing that expression of absolute certainty that had made him a hero to millions and unbearable to millions more. He told Crockett, in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by being so direct, that he had genuine questions about whether freshman representatives who spent more time on Twitter than in committee meetings were actually equipped to govern a nation of 330 million people. The question, he said, wasn't whether her intentions were good. He was willing to assume they were. The question was whether good intentions without policy expertise or legislative accomplishment actually helped anyone beyond generating applause from people who already agreed with her. It was a familiar opening. Shapiro had used variations of this approach hundreds of times. Establish intellectual authority, question credentials, frame the conversation as mentor educating student, wait for the emotional response, then dismantle it with facts and logic while the opponent was still caught in their feelings. It had worked on campus activists, on cable news contributors, on podcast hosts who thought they could match his preparation. It had become his signature move, refined over thousands of hours of broadcast experience into something approaching muscle memory. Crockett let him finish completely. She did not interrupt, did not object, did not offer the defensive response that Shapiro's question had been designed to provoke. She sat perfectly still in the guest chair, her posture relaxed but attentive, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. She waited until she was certain he was done, and then she waited 3 seconds longer, letting the silence settle in the studio just enough to shift the energy in the room from interrogation to something else entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost gentle. She thanked him for the question and told him she appreciated his directness because it gave her an opportunity to clear up what appeared to be a significant misunderstanding about her actual record. She reached down beside her chair and lifted a leather portfolio onto her lap. The portfolio was thick enough that it made a soft sound when she set it on the armrest. She opened it with the kind of careful precision that suggested she knew exactly where everything inside was located, which she did, because she had spent the previous evening organizing every document in the order she would need them. She began with a simple correction. Shapiro had characterized her legislative record as consisting primarily of symbolic gestures. She wondered if he had actually reviewed her legislative record or if he was working from summaries prepared by his research team. It was not a hostile question. She asked it the way a professor might ask a student whether they had completed the assigned reading, giving them room to admit the truth without shame. Shapiro told her he was quite familiar with her record, thank you, and that his characterization stood. She nodded slowly as if she had expected exactly that answer and told him she wanted to walk through a few specific items just to make sure they were working from the same set of facts. The first document she removed from the portfolio was a bill summary from the Congressional Research Service. House Resolution 2847, the Correctional Facility Accountability and Transparency Act, which she had not merely co-sponsored but had written and introduced in her first term. The bill had passed the House with bipartisan support, picked up 12 Republican co-sponsors, and was currently in Senate committee with a realistic path to passage. She noted the date of introduction, the committee hearings where she had testified, the amendments she had negotiated to secure conservative votes. She placed the document on the small table between them, positioning it so the official congressional seal was visible to the camera. Shapiro glanced at the document but did not pick it up. He told her that one bill did not constitute a substantive legislative record, especially when the bill in question had not yet become law. Crockett agreed with him completely. One bill absolutely did not constitute a record. That was why she had brought the rest of the portfolio. She removed a second document, then a third, then a fourth, creating a small stack on the table. The Veteran Housing Security Act, which had been incorporated into the previous year's Defense Authorization Bill and was now law. The Small Business Recovery and Resilience Act, which had passed committee and was awaiting floor vote. The Maternal Mortality Review Standardization Act, which had been signed into law 4 months ago, and which Shapiro's own sister, a physician, had praised in a medical journal article that Crockett had printed and included in the portfolio. She walked through each bill's history with the same measured precision: committee assignments, hearing dates, amendment negotiations, vote counts, bipartisan co-sponsors by name. She did not editorialize. She did not celebrate. She simply presented documentation that contradicted the characterization Shapiro had opened with, allowing the facts to speak without amplification. Something in Shapiro's expression shifted. It was subtle, barely perceptible if you were not watching closely, but the cameras were watching very closely, and so was Crockett. The absolute certainty that had armored his opening had developed the smallest crack. He sat forward slightly, reaching for the document about his sister's article, scanning it quickly to verify it was real. It was real. The citation was correct. The praise was genuine. His sister had specifically highlighted Crockett's legislative work on maternal mortality as an example of evidence-based policymaking that transcended partisan divisions. Shapiro set the document back down and pivoted. He told Crockett that he appreciated the correction on her legislative record, which was more substantive than he had initially credited, but that his broader point remained valid. Legislative activity was not the same as legislative impact, and the progressive policies she advocated for, regardless of how many bills she passed, were fundamentally disconnected from economic reality. He shifted into what was clearly a prepared section of the interview, rattling off statistics about inflation, about federal spending, about the proven track record of market-based solutions versus government intervention. He spoke rapidly, the way he always did when he wanted to overwhelm an opponent with volume, cramming multiple arguments into a single breath so they would have to choose which one to address and leave the others unchallenged. Crockett waited for him to finish. Then she asked him a simple question. She asked if he had reviewed the Congressional Budget Office scoring on any of the legislation she had just described. Shapiro told her he was familiar with CBO methodologies and that he had concerns about their assumptions, but yes, he understood they had scored her bills as deficit neutral or cost-saving. Crockett thanked him for confirming that and asked if he was aware that 2 of her bills had actually been praised by the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, as examples of market-friendly approaches to social problems. Shapiro paused. He had not been aware of that. Crockett removed another document from the portfolio. The AEI analysis, dated 6 weeks earlier, with specific sections highlighted. She offered it to him. He took it this time, read the highlighted sections, and set it down without comment. The rhythm of the interview had changed. Shapiro was no longer leading. He was responding. Crockett was not raising her voice or accelerating her pace. If anything, she was speaking more slowly than she had at the start, giving each fact room to land before introducing the next one. She told Shapiro she wanted to address his point about progressive policies being disconnected from economic reality because it was an important concern and one she had heard from many voters in her district, including voters who had supported Trump in 2016 and 2020. She asked if he would be willing to look at some actual economic data rather than theoretical arguments about how markets should work. Shapiro told her he was always willing to look at data. Crockett opened the portfolio to a tabbed section and removed a stapled packet. The packet contained Bureau of Labor Statistics data, Federal Reserve economic analysis, and Congressional Budget Office projections, all focused on a single policy area that Shapiro had been particularly vocal about. She had heard him argue dozens of times on his show that raising the minimum wage was economically destructive, that it killed jobs, and that it hurt the very people progressives claimed to want to help. She asked him if that was still his position. He confirmed it was. She asked him if he had reviewed the employment data from the 31 states and localities that had raised their minimum wage above the federal level over the past decade. Shapiro told her that cherry-picking data from specific locations did not prove a national trend. Crockett agreed that cherry-picking was poor methodology. That was why she had not cherry-picked. She had included all 31 jurisdictions, every single one. The packet contained employment data, business formation data, and wage growth data for every location that had implemented a higher minimum wage compared against comparable jurisdictions that had not. She walked him through the methodology, which had been developed by economists at the University of California and MIT, neither of which anyone could credibly characterize as conservative institutions, but both of which had reputations for methodological rigor that even Shapiro's audience would respect. The data showed something Shapiro had not expected. In 29 of the 31 jurisdictions, employment had grown faster after the minimum wage increase than before it. Small business formation had remained stable or increased in 27 of 31. Wage growth for workers in the bottom quartile had accelerated in all 31 without exception. Crockett did not present this as a gotcha. She presented it as information that surprised her too when she first encountered it, because it contradicted what she had been taught in her college economics classes. But the data was the data, and if they were going to have a conversation about economic reality, she thought they should start with reality rather than with theory about how reality should look.